all about trying to oppress and intimidate with their monuments, with their statues. But yet when they found out, when they saw the statue, the guy who paid for it said, "This is great," because it's actually a third figure that they didn't have to pay for. He said, "You know what? It makes this statue a lot better." And he actually wrote a letter to one of his friends talking about how great this. There's an Indian girl in this statue. It's so great. But the story, the history of that statue, doesn't really line up with what's being told about the motivations behind these Confederate monuments that went up at the same time. So I looked into it a little bit more, and it just it doesn't make sense, because in addition to the one thing that was popular at that time besides Confederate monuments was non-Confederate monuments. It turns out that the entire early 20th century, during those decades, was there was the City Beautiful movement, which was all about installing these kinds of Greek-type columns and fancy statues to kind of beautify the town square. And so you've got statues of Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson down south. You've got statues of Jefferson, Lewis. These, they don't tell you that part. And that's the part that really gets to me. That, wait a second, there's a part of this story that's not being told. That you read a column in the newspaper, you read a story about it, and they tell you, okay, well, this was a slaveholder. This was somebody who fought to destroy America, to destroy the Union, to perpetuate the practice of slavery. And these people, 30, 40, 50 years later, put up statues to memorialize these monsters. And those people were monsters too. And you know, I don't want to say, I don't want to speak in defense of slavery, but I want to speak in defense of people who put up monsters. That the truth is not being told, and I'm concerned that the truth really doesn't matter to some people. And so my ultimate point is that the truth should matter, and that there's another story that's not being told, that if people would just dig a little bit deeper, ask a few more questions, you know, it might make you a little bit curious. I looked it up today, however. The bad news is that despite the apparent non-racist motivations behind the Lewis and Clark statue in Charlottesville, in fact, it's probably a fairly progressive statue to have a woman of color. That statue's coming down because the city council in Charlottesville voted against it last fall. And it's because Sacagawea is taking a sort of a deferential pose behind Lewis and Clark. And it just seems like, well, so that one has to come down. You know what they're going to come for next? They're going to come for this Sacagawea statue. Because ultimately, Sacagawea is not a heroic figure, because you know what she was? She was a guide for this military expedition. Both Lewis and Clark were slaveholders. In fact, William Clark brought a slave with him. He brought a slave and took, on this very river right here, he took a slave with him, brought slaves into the Montana Territory. It wasn't the Montana Territory at the time. But there's the argument that can be made, well, Lewis and Clark aren't heroes either, and Sacagawea, can you believe that she was actually helping these people? And so, the truth should matter. Just dig a little bit deeper. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reeds. These are difficult, complex issues, and the truth comes out through opportunities like this to hear different sides, through dialogue. To come down, which is basically my position. All of them down. Every single statue. I don't understand. Grew up with. Didn't we read in the Bible like all the good guys? They smashed the statues, right? But grew up also in North Carolina, where the history of the Confederacy and the war there, it's difficult. It's difficult for a lot of people. Our next speaker is Mr. Frank McLean.
Well, I thought we should probably celebrate independence, because isn't Independence Day tomorrow? Is that better? Okay. I do celebrate my independence because I'm one of these guys that was a little bit thinking too much for himself, and didn't want to go along with the way lots of things are done in business. We have in our country the idea that there's a master and a slave. There's an employer and an employee. The employer, the master. And this, especially since we have employment tax laws, the government has decided that because somebody has a bunch of slaves, they owe taxes. It's called employment taxes. They came into being in 1935, almost 80, well, I guess that is 85 years ago. But I was born in 1949. Why do I have to obey a law that was passed in 1935? I was not for that law. I wasn't even existing yet. But there is a Constitution that gives us the right to freely associate with one another under the First Amendment. Which means, you know something? We can treat one another as independent contractors. We can treat one another, my slave. We're equals. We are to respect and care for one another. And be fair to one another. So in my business, I ran a nursing service in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And actually at the time of when I was indicted for being a bad boy, using independent contractors when they should have been employees, I was living here in Montana. Now, usually, if I had a slave, don't you think you'd want to have control over that slave? And, you know, make sure he's doing the right job and doing this. How could I be out in Montana walking through the mountains, enjoying the fields, going swimming in the Yellowstone River? How could I watch that slave back in Minneapolis, Minnesota? What? That's what the government thinks we should do. I was to be an employer, and they were to be my employee. I was to be the master, they were my slaves, because I was paying them to work. But in fact, in my mind, they were independent contractors, and I treated them as equals, all these people. So we get to these things about in America, that there's all these laws on the books, and apparently I committed a crime without even knowing it. I used independent contractors and did not pay the government a withholding tax. So instead of honoring my life and my family, the government put me in prison for 4 years. And Roger Roots tried to help me get out.
Too late. It was too late.
Yeah, I was too bad a boy that America is created for independent contractors, not for slaves, not for master slaves. We are here equal with one another, and we have the right to freely contract, freely associate, make agreements with one another, honor one another. And so those are some of the laws that I think eventually should be thrown out, as well as all licensing laws, I believe, should be thrown out. Can't we as human beings make our own contracts and honor our contracts? This is what the Constitution says. There shall be no law to violate contracts. It's right in the Constitution. The government shall make no law that infringes upon contracts. But it seems like that's all they want to do, is make laws infringing on our freedoms and infringing on our ability to honor one another. Anyhow, I thought we should celebrate Independence Day and celebrate the fact that I am freely walking in Montana again. Amen. And I'm not in the federal system. Now, I wanted to mention one other thing about the federal system and about prison itself. First off, if you read the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment says no one shall have their life, liberty, or property taken away without due process of law. And what does due process of law mean? If a trial by jury, a trial by the people around you, and to see have you had criminal intent? Have you been a bad boy? Have you been violent to somebody else? Have you been taking away from somebody else that you should be locked up because you're such a bad person? That's due process of law. But we don't go by that anymore. When they wanted to take and put me down, they came up to my property in Paradise Valley, and they had their sheriffs with guns. And they took me away and threw me in prison without due process of law. Right? Why are there laws made where they can just pick a man up off of his own property and say, you're charged with a crime, and then they throw you in prison? Now, what has happened in America that this is happening all the time? All they have to do is say, oh, we got an indictment, a grand jury indictment, and therefore we don't believe that you'll show up for it, so we're going to take you off the street and throw you in prison without any trial, without even going in front of a judge or anything. So I was put in isolation in Mammoth Hot Springs, which was the only federal prison around, for 8 days of my life in isolation. Now, why is that allowed in America? Is it a good thing? Well, some people say, well, this Frank McLean, he looks different, he thinks different, he runs his own deal. Yeah, let's take him off the street because somebody's called him a criminal. The indictments that they get, they're not real indictments. The indictment against me didn't even name the essential elements of the crime. It's just the rights of us as human beings have been taken away from us by, I don't know why, there's other human beings in the government working, but they think they have to follow some kind of judges or some kind of prosecutors who want to put people behind bars. Now, when I was behind bars, I saw a lot of suffering. And I suffered myself to a degree, but who really suffered was my wife and my children. Luckily, my wife stuck with me. But the statistics are, in prison, if a man goes down for more than 2 years, he doesn't come back to a wife. So our system is to break up the families. We're not a loving Christian nation. Are you kidding? A loving Christian nation means We want our families to stay together. We want mom and dad to be there for the kids. We want the kids to have mom and dad to go to and to grow with. But when you throw people in prison, we are a suffering society, because as somebody mentioned earlier, we have the most prisoners in history, locked up, people locked up. And it's not just those people who are suffering though. It's like, hey, it's like this virus. Oh yeah, you've got one person, and then you have somebody else get sick, then somebody else gets sick, somebody else. Okay, that's what that does. But when you lock somebody up, you're affecting not only that person, but how many? I ran a business. I had 300 independent contractors, and they all lost their jobs. Were people affected? Yes. The wrong way. They were making money. And they took that away from us. Not just me, but from those contractors that I was dealing with. And their families suffered. But then my family also suffered. My wife, she wasn't into the thing of making money. How is she going to make ends meet? How is she going to make mortgage payments? How is she going to keep our ranch going? She didn't have the first idea about it. Luckily, there was grace, and we survived. But anyhow, I guess I don't want to go on and on, but each of us should be aware that we can be true to our own selves, and we can live in freedom. We can live with love in our hearts. We can honor everyone around us. I even honor the judge who threw me behind bars. God forgive him. He knows not what he does. People make errors. I forgive the prosecutor. He made errors. They read into laws that aren't even there. There is no law against independent contracting. Show me it. Or maybe it was 1870s, after the 14th Amendment, saying that there shall be, no state shall make a law that inhibits one. The government is gone amok, but we, the people, are supposed to be the government.
Thanks, Mr. McLean. Yeah, when I first heard the name Rage Against the State, I don't feel rage. But sometimes I wonder, how arrogant. I haven't had to spend 4 years in prison. Got lucky. Had people come to me many times, because I've got a lot of properties, I have a lot of different things going on. They'll say, hey, I need a little bit of money, extra money. I'll just pick up trash around this property here. Just give me like $4 or $5 an hour. I kind of enjoy it. I'll have my headphones in. I say, sure, no problem. Consenting adult, you want to pick up trash from the property? I want to give you $4. It's just the grace of God I'm not in prison. People say, look, in the wintertime you got no work. In the summer you have tons of work. Can't I just work 70 hours a week in the summer? I'm a single guy. I want to bag some money. I'll rest up in the winter. I can't afford to pay overtime. No. I'm willing to work for regular wages. You don't understand. Just because we're consenting adults doesn't mean that we can make an agreement. I could have gotten thrown in prison. So maybe it's a little arrogant of me not to think that rage could be an appropriate term. But at the same time, it's good to see that forgiveness and hope is still our long-term goal. Because we do believe that ultimately the right ideas of freedom for consenting adults to engage in any contract they want, will prevail, because people understand that any individual before God is sovereign over his own life. So our penultimate speaker, somebody pilfered my list. Our penultimate speaker is Roger Roots. All right.
Okay, all right. I'm Roger Roots. I'm founder of Lysander Spooner University, which is one of the sponsors of this event. Lysander Spooner was a great writer in Massachusetts back in the 1800s. Every single time I ever open up any of his writings and start reading, I say to myself, wow, that is me. Those are my thoughts. And so I founded Lysander Spooner University a couple of years ago. He is me. I honestly think, I may be a reincarnation of Lysander Spooner. He was an anti-government writer back in the 1800s, and he had some great insights about life in the 1800s in Massachusetts, and about he was an abolitionist. He actually tried to compete with the U.S. Postal Service, and he was actually destroyed by the federal government. They SWAT teamed him. They destroyed his business. He tried to be a lawyer. They destroyed his law practice. Anyway, I sell his books for $16 a piece. And by the way, I invite any of you to look at LysanderSpoonerUniversity.com, which is the website. I am the guy that came up with the name Rage Against the State for this event, okay? And I proudly do so. And people they tried to talk me out of it. No, call it Liberty Picnic. Call it Freedom Fest. Call it Liberty Fest or something like that. And I am the guy that insisted on Rage Against the State, all right? And I do so because I know that not everyone agrees with me. I'd like to pass out my little... I only have 10 of these. Let's pass these around. I believe that it is my mission in life. I only have 10 of them, but maybe you guys can share my little talk today. It is my mission in life to promote suspicion, distrust, mockery, contempt, and hatred for government. I proudly do so. All right? And I frequently get in arguments with people who challenge me. No, we're against corrupt government. Roger, you can't say you're anti-government. It's almost a religious thing. You know, it's so deeply embedded. And I am an Eagle Scout, all right? I grew up, I grew up reverent to all these wonderful institutions of America. But it's taken me a long time to realize that government is an evil. Thomas Jefferson said, well, maybe it's a necessary evil. Maybe. I'm not even prepared to say that. It is an evil, all right? The government, everything that government does is pretty much an evil on this land. And I would even say that if you're talking about a pandemic, the greatest disease on the surface of the earth is government. And I want to go through some facts and figures and show that as government grows, human life is more limited. Human life suffers. Human misery increases when government increases. We're living in these wonderful times right now. Katura talked about how there's change in the air right now, the year 2020. So many things going on. I think there's so much potential for the future. One thing that's happening in our culture, in our society, is contempt for government is increasing, and I think that's great. We should cheer every time we hear. When Donald Trump, there's videos. Go on YouTube. There are videos of the President of the United States. He'll walk up to a little kid this tall, 4 or 5 years old. And there's videos on YouTube. And he'll reach out to shake the kid's hand. It'll be a great moment for a photo. And the kid will say, "Screw you, scumbag." You seen these videos? Any of you seen these? A kid this tall, the most powerful government official in the world. Why? This is the man, the leader of the Western world. All of us grew up. We're supposed to, be reverent for government. A 5-year-old kid now tells the President of the United States, "Screw you, dirtbag." And I think that's great. This is great. We are on the verge of great things. This is fantastic. Regardless of what you think of Trump. I mean, I'm not even wading into that one. Start with for those of you who have this, look at the growth of government in the first. I wish I had a PowerPoint slide. By the way, Lysander Spooner University is in need of a projector. We need. So if any of you want to chip in on a projector, it'd be great to show this on a screen. You see that government is growing. If you love government, if you think government's a great thing, you have won everything in the last century because government is growing, state and federal. You can see that graph. It's now 60% of all GDP. So all dollars spent in America, government is now over half. And by the way, you see those spikes. You know what those spikes are in government growth? One is in the 1920s, one's about the 1940s. You know what those are, obviously? Those are wars. A war is the health of the state. If you love government, you should love war. If you're a liberal and you want big socialism, big government, you should cheer when there's talk of war. If you're a conservative and you say you don't like government, you want government to be limited, you should hate any talk of war. And you see those spikes when they start, the rate of GDP, the percentage of GDP that is government, is smaller than at the end of the war. So at the end of the spike, when spending goes down, government is bigger each time. By the way, right now, this chart does not go to 2020, but right now I can tell you government spending as a percentage of total GDP in this country is higher than World War II. We are at an all-time high. Government is now eating up the market share of the world. You can see that government is going up and up and up as a percentage of total spending. By the way, what happens when it gets to 90% or 100%? That's what you call absolute hell, misery, suffering, slavery. There's no other way to say it. If you love government, you should know that you've been on the winning side for 100 years. And I think that's about to change. The winds of change are in the air, and I think there's a lot of great things that are about to happen. During this COVID hoax, I said it, millions of people have been put out of work by force with guns. No government person at any level, state, federal, or local, has lost his job. Not one. Not one of them has lost a paycheck. Millions of us have lost our paychecks. Not one government official has lost a paycheck. And I'm going to tell you right now, that isn't going to last very long, folks. No, it isn't. Why? Because the private sector is actually the source of all true wealth and all true prosperity. The private sector pays for it all. And you can see that government is a leech. It is a parasite on the world. And it's been eating more and more of the market share of the earth for the last 100 years. And that ain't going to last much longer, folks. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to predict a year from now that some of these government workers around us will have missed a paycheck. Anybody want to bet me? I can't believe there's national discussions now. I've been fighting to defund police myself for 20 years. 20 years. I wrote a law review article in 2001 called Are Cops Constitutional? I pointed out that at the time of the Bill of Rights was drafted, at the time of the Founding Fathers, there was no such thing as professional police. It was all done by private sector posses, and there was constables here and there were sheriffs, but it was posses. It was, when a crime was committed, you had a duty to try to fight crime yourself. It was the private sector. The sheriffs often took fees. They worked for nothing. There are cops right now making $400,000 a year. Google it. Massachusetts has over 240 cops that make over $200,000 a year. That's just in one agency, Massachusetts State Police. The graph of U.S. government growth, the next chart, is several other governments. All governments in the world, generally, Germany, United Kingdom, Japan, all have been growing. Government is like a cancer on the earth that has been growing and growing and growing worldwide in the last 150 years. It ain't going to last much longer, folks. It's funny, there are these competing charts and graphs. Human well-being has improved during this time. So you might question me and say, well, Roger, as government has been growing, wouldn't you admit that life expectancy has been growing? Yes, yeah, generally. Almost every measurement of human well-being has been improving. Everything from, average incomes, household incomes, average square foot of residential living space has grown. Almost every single measurement of human well-being has improved. But here's why I say government is the evil, because you can separate that out. You see that the share of the population living in extreme poverty by region. You can see that those parts of the world that have really embraced capitalism and freedom and limited government, their share of people living in poverty has plummeted much faster. Whereas the places where government has been growing more, like the West being Europe, the United States, the share of people living in poverty has gone down not quite as sharply. Okay, so you can separate those out, and you see that the places in the world, the third world, the developing world, is actually getting healthier and wealthier because they actually copied early America. They've been embracing some market freedom over the last 100 years, embracing a little bit more capitalism. Life expectancy has been going up and up and up. But actually, by the way, did you know in the last 50 years, what country? There's only one country where life expectancy has gone down. Anybody know what that is? North Korea. North Korea. The only country on earth where life expectancy has gone down in 50 years. Did you know the United States has tabled? It has flatlined. It had life expectancy going up and up and up, and then as government has taken more and more control over health care, Obamacare, Medicare expansion, Medicaid, etc., it has stopped. Life expectancy stopped going up as government has gotten more and more involved. In fact, we've had a couple recent years where life expectancy declined as government has taken a bigger and bigger role over health care. In fact, they want to put us into a slave plantation style health care agenda. And as we get closer and closer and closer to that, life expectancy has stopped growing. I have a little graph here about South Korea. South Korea now has, I believe, the highest life expectancy for females in the world. It's over 90. If you're in South Korea, your life expectancy of female is over 90 years old. Here's what's bizarre. When we fought the Korean War, the United States fought the Korean War in the early 1950s. My father is in the audience, Dallas Roots, and he is a Korea-era veteran. So in his lifetime, Korea went from a third world country to a richer country in some ways than the United States. Think about that. In his lifetime. At the time of the Korean War, the average life expectancy in Korea was in the 40s, low 40s. Now it's the highest in the world. Why? Because of capitalism, because of freedom, because of free market economics. Compare that to North Korea, which went the exact opposite. It's the only country on earth where life expectancy has gone down because it embraced government. The four Asian tigers. You know what the four Asian tigers are? Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea. They have made themselves rich by embracing capitalism, freedom, property rights. They actually have trial by jury in South Korea. The right to trial by jury. They've copied the English common law in Hong Kong. You see that Singapore, this chart here is the GDP per person as a percentage of the United States. Hong Kong is identical. So the average GDP per person in Hong Kong is identical to the United States. Singapore is above. Singapore, again, was a third world country just 50 years ago. Now it's richer than the United States. And it got there by freedom, by capitalism and free markets and property rights. I used to be a real racist. All right, I used to think race defined a lot about human development and human well-being and human history. And I kept reading things that conflicted with that. One of them is Hong Kong. You can't really... Hong Kong is an interesting place because race doesn't explain much about Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a little island without a lot of resources. It is the same race as China. In fact, many of the same families, they have brothers and sisters who fled China and went to Hong Kong. It's the same exact race as China. And yet, for the last 50 years or so, the average net worth in Hong Kong is 10 times the average net worth of and household income as well of the mainland China. It's the same race. What accounts for 10 times greater wealth in Hong Kong? By the way, that what I just said is true as of about 1997. You know, it now has been taken back by China or given back to China, and it's now losing its status of the richest, most free place in the world. For years, it was the freest place on earth. But race does not explain much about, and by the way, North Korea, South Korea, same race, same exact race. One of them is poor, one of them is rich, healthy, wealthy, and wise. One of them is poor, enslaved, impoverished, living in misery. Race doesn't explain much. Freedom does. Freedom explains a lot. Some of us talk about books that changed our lives. I read a book called The Ultimate Resource 2, written by a professor of business administration at the University of Maryland named Julian Simon. It's a boring book. It's a thick book. Changed my life. Again, like I said, I used to be an extreme racist. I used to think race defined so much. Almost was the describing, I guess, factor in world history and world development and economics. But that book, The Ultimate Resource, is really a boring book. I frequently recommend it. I've recommended it to all my family members. I don't know if no one ever reads it. It's a boring book. It's a book about prices. Prices have gone down and down and down. Prices of everything. Did you know that? Prices of every commodity in the world. Zinc, tin, copper, coal, petroleum. Almost every commodity in the world. The price has gone down in the last 200 years. Even though human population has increased and demand has exploded. What possible explanation? It defies economics. It defies every law of economics, because we all know that supply and demand, right? As demand goes up, well, the price has to go up. And yet prices held steadily. If you control for inflation, prices of everything have gone down, even though population has been going up and up and up. Why? The answer is the human mind. The human mind is the ultimate resource. And as long as it's free, it can solve any problem. The human mind can fix anything as long as it's free. But when it's captured by government, it stops. It stops innovating. It stops inventing. Peter Thiel. Anybody know who Peter Thiel is? Peter Thiel is he's a billionaire. He is the founder of PayPal, among other corporations. He was one of the big investors in Facebook. He's a genius, all right? And he's a libertarian, by the way. He has a counter-argument. He talks about how human innovation has actually stopped because of all the government regulation. All that is good about American history is anti-government. America was founded upon anti-government principles. The Bill of Rights is anti-government. All that is good and great, the abundance, the prosperity of America came from anti-government culture and anti-government philosophy. Peter Thiel makes the argument that human innovation stopped probably a quarter century ago in so many ways. The Empire State Building, the World Trade Center. The Empire State Building was built in the 1930s in like 3 years. There's great stories about how the iron workers would be would be up there, and the crane would lift the steel beam up. They'd connect the crane, and when they grabbed the beam, it was still warm. The steel was still warm. It had come from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania on a truck, and they had those trucks rolling, and they were working day and night. When they grabbed that steel, it was still hot. And there's great pictures of those workers eating their lunch pails. They're sitting on these beams, and they're a quarter mile up in the air. There's no lanyards, there's no ropes, there's no protection. Some of them have their hard hats off. OSHA today would fine them $1 million. They'd be put out of business. Today, they can't even rebuild the World Trade Center in 15 years. Okay, they built the Empire State Building in 3 years. There is Peter Thiel talks about it, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco was built in a year and a half. Today, they're building an on-ramp that has taken like 8 years, an on-ramp to the Golden Gate Bridge. Government regulation is choking the world, not just America. It's choking the world. We've got to defeat it. And I believe we're going to. Things are going to start changing very rapidly. Many other things that, the number of businesses is lower today than it was 30 years ago. Did you guys know that? The number of corporations on the New York Stock Exchange, the number of corporations is fewer today than it was 30 years ago. Why? Because of government regulations. Government regulations are killing humanity, and by the way, also killing all the other flora and fauna of the earth. And I'll get into that. In my lifetime, China has been a big thing. China has grown, the growth rates. But if you look at that chart there, the Chinese economy has grown exponentially. But government is now choking further Chinese growth. You look at growth in places like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, much sharper, much steeper growth. They are growing faster. China, even though it tried to embrace capitalism a little bit, trade on a massive scale, unfortunately, China is still under the thumb of central planning, socialism, and too much government. And Chinese growth is much slower than those other places. Now, there's a graph here of U.S. economic growth. U.S. economic growth grew like 10% annually for much of our history. All through the 19th century and the early 20th century. We grew 10% annually, down to about 8% for a long time. You know where we are now? We're below zero at this point because of the government's COVID scam. But even during all the 8 years of the Obama administration, he never got above, 1% growth. Okay. Now, growth is something funny. People who call themselves liberals sometimes say, well, what's so great about growth? And I thought that myself. Well, what's so great about growth? Greta Thunberg, the young teenage girl that goes around and lectures us about climate change. In that great speech where she says, "How dare you?" In parts of that speech, she condemns growth. She said, "Well, you want growth? How dare you? You've sacrificed everything for growth. How dare you?" Growth. I'm trying to think of the guy, George Gilder, one of the great futurists. He says growth is really knowledge, and if you don't have growth, that means knowledge isn't growing. All the libraries that we have are that's growth. That is the growth of knowledge. People learning how to do stuff easier and cheaper. I talked about the book, The Ultimate Resource, that being the human mind. And as long as it's free, it can solve any problem. And every human being on the face of the earth is a problem solver, some more than others. But the thing is, we want more people on the face of the earth. The more people, the better. We live easier lives the more people are on the earth, because every human being is a problem solver, and they help us. They make commodities cheaper, even though that defies all economics, because they innovate. Every human being is a problem solver. And so if you say you don't want growth, that means that you don't want intellectual knowledge to continue growing. And again, I'm going to show that even the flora and fauna, even the environment, is actually improved when there is human growth of population. You wouldn't guess that. But the facts are fairly clear. I'm going to show you some of the data on it. The Bible, in the Adam and Eve, the Bible talks about humans are to be stewards of the earth. Humans improve everything about the earth. There's a great scientist who actually was one of the founders of the Greenpeace. His name is Patrick Moore. He has a novel theory. He goes back into the core samples, the deepest part of the earth. The earth 4 billion years old, he says. He says that for the longest period of time, of course, life did not exist on the earth. This carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 20 times what it is now. Right now it's 400 parts per million. It was 20 times that, 10 to 20 times at different stages of prehistory. And what happened is early life, which lasted millions of years, one single-celled organism, just the most primitive forms of life, which existed on this planet far more years than humans ever have. All right, we are a spark. Okay, single-celled organisms dominated this planet for millions and millions of years. And then what they did is they sucked the CO2. These early plants sucked so much CO2 out of the atmosphere, and a lot of them died and were buried in mud. Some of it went to the bottom of the oceans. Concrete, cement. A lot of people don't realize that cement is a carbon. You guys know that cement is organic. It's partially carbon-based because it is ancient seashell stuff that is limestone. Limestone is baked. Concrete is partially baked limestone, ground up, baked, powderized. And so concrete is an organic substance. And all that stuff, when you see limestone is ancient plant matter that sucked CO2 out of the atmosphere and died and kept it there for years. CO2 in the atmosphere got down to 170 parts per million about a couple thousand years ago. All life on Earth dies when it gets to 150 parts per million. If CO2 ever drops to 150 parts per million, all life on Earth dies. Humans saved the Earth when they started burning fossil fuels and burning wood and using cement and recovering some of this stuff from the world. And thank God we've got CO2 up there, and it looks like humans have saved the Earth. Literally, we have saved the Earth, according to Patrick Moore. A fascinating theory. Government regulations increase costs but do not improve quality. They're on page 3, at the very top there's a chart of products that have increased most in cost. Guess what, folks? The products that are most government regulated have increased the most in cost, okay? Most of us know this. Healthcare is one of the most regulated industries in the world. Costs have gone up faster than inflation almost every year for 30 or 40 or 50 years because of government. College, universities, the student loan program. Tuition at colleges has gone up faster than the rate of inflation every single year for 30 years because of government intervention, because of the student loan program. And by the way, the colleges today are cesspools of government extreme pro-government extremism. Anti-government thought is practically banned at most universities. They are funded. It's just come out that the Ivy League is over half federally funded now. Okay, so they're being federally funded, and they churn out pro-government so-called scholarship, so-called research. They just churn it out, one after another. A couple of years back, the Koch brothers, who are these billionaire, sort of libertarian oil barons down from Kansas, they came up to Montana State University. They wanted to offer millions. They did actually pay Montana. They wanted to establish some libertarian thinking, think tank type stuff at MSU. Little did they know that the faculty wasn't going to put up with it. And the faculty actually went crazy. The faculty at MSU had meetings, faculty meetings. We've got to stop the Koch brothers from funding anti-government research because we want only pro-government research. That's every government-supported college in the world. They just churn out pro-government extremist so-called science. One study, one fake research report after another. Fake, fake, fake. If you want a real university, check out LysanderSponerUniversity.com. Spending on education has increased exponentially. Quality is flat. Every measurement of performance in public schools, math, science, you couldn't invent a measurement that isn't flat. And yet government spending has gone up exponentially. Time and again, they spend. Government just has destroyed education. All outputs are flat. Everything that government spends money on is destroyed. It costs twice what anything else would cost. You know, we think there's government benefits, right? But the private sector could provide those for half. Anything that government provides, the private sector could give it to you for half that much. Folks, it's going to change real fast. Poorer households suffer more from government regulations than rich households. Did you know that? Poor, minorities, the vulnerable, they suffer more. And by the way, their percentage of total spending in a poor household on regulated items is vastly increased. The more heavily regulated items in the household, the poor spends far more of their total expenses on those items. What about the environment? When the Berlin Wall came down, what side was more polluted? This is obvious to anyone who knows anything about history. The East German side was vastly more polluted, but it was measurable. The rivers were dirtier. The air was dirtier. The capitalist side, the free side, where you'd think, according to the government, there was more freedom, and well, the argument is that the private sector is bad for the environment. That's what the government wants to tell you. But when the Berlin Wall came down, East Germany, and by the way, the entire Eastern Bloc was far more polluted. And by the way, that pollution lasted for another 20 or 30 years. It's just now getting, and by the way, life expectancy much lower in the Soviet bloc, much higher in capitalist societies. You can do the same analysis at South Korea, North Korea. Air quality greatly improved after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's very measurable. As markets grow, per capita energy consumption plummets. This is something they don't want you to know. Okay, these people who are concerned about CO2, again, CO2 is one of those government scams. This climate doomsday, another government scam. Almost every big thing that government throws out as a big balloon that we're supposed to obey them about turns out to be a total hoax. The climate doomsday scam may be the biggest. I said it was the biggest until the COVID scam came around. All right, it might even be bigger because they're rolling it out, and it's so fake that it might even compete with the climate doomsday hoax. But did I mention I'm a candidate for state auditor? Okay, what I wanted to say here is, as markets grow, per capita energy consumption plummets. We are getting more and more efficient. I go back to that book, The Ultimate Resource, about how human ingenuity has driven prices lower and lower and lower, even though there's more people on the planet and more demand. The human mind is solving all these problems. They're going back to coal mines in England that they thought were tapped out 100 years ago. And they're going back to the same coal mines they thought were emptied, but with the new, more efficient extraction techniques, they're now getting even more coal than they ever thought was there in the first place 100 years ago. Humans are getting more efficient. We are actually, if you believe in the CO2, the government CO2 thing, you should know that capitalism and freedom and free markets actually are driving people to be more efficient. We produce less CO2 for the same transportation or the same commercial or residential industrial uses. We are getting more and more efficient wherever there's not government.